When it comes to the most prestigious film festivals in the world for premiering documentaries, Sundance is probably right at the top of that list.
Audience Award for U.S. Documentary.
Jury Award for Non-Fiction.
A Documentary Award for Cinematography.
A U.S. Documentary Cinematography.
Premiering your film at Sundance means it's basically one of the best documentaries in the world that year, so it's no surprise that the cinematography of these films is also world-class. But when IndieWire released their report on the most popular cameras that these elite cinematographers were using, the results were definitely illuminating. So this video is all about breaking down those top 5 go-to cameras for high-end doc cinematographers according to Sundance, what these productions value in their workhorse cameras, and what does all this tell us about the best cameras to invest in ourselves. So IndieWire publishes this list every year. Sometime after Sundance wraps, they call all the DPs and ask them what cameras and lenses they shot on and why. I read the article every year because there's a lot to learn about trends in the industry and how to make smart long-term gear investments by seeing what the best of the best are doing. Like if you've been hanging around the YouTube filmmaking world for a while, you've probably heard someone say something like, the camera doesn't matter.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Yeah.
But if that's true, then why are so many of these DPs using such similar setups? If gear doesn't matter, then why are just 2 brands dominating the dock market? And in a time when everyone seems obsessed with waiting for the Mark II version to drop, what can we learn from the fact that only one camera in the top 5 is less than 5 years old? Now, the camera models themselves are way less interesting than what they teach us about what professional cinematographers actually need. But before we get too deep into those lessons and what they mean for your future gear investments, let's just run through this list quickly. In first place is the Sony FX9, which was used on 4 of the top 20 films. Next is the Canon C300 Mark II, yes, the Mark II, not the Mark III, with 3 films. And from there, it's the FS7, the FX3, and lastly the C500 Mark II, with all of those getting 3 films each as well, so it's really a 4-way tie for second place. That doesn't mean that these were the only cameras used, because there was, I think, 1 Red, or maybe 2, an Alexa Mini, an Amira, and maybe a Blackmagic, I can't remember exactly. There was a decent variety across the films actually, but at least 16 of the top 20 films had one of the cameras from that list on set. They used them in different combinations with different A-cam and B-cam setups, and even some projects shooting both Canon and Sony at the same time, but the data tells us that really good doc DPs are going to those 5 cameras more than any others. But before we break down exactly what that means, let's first talk about what surprised me with this list. Now, the list itself is pretty much what I expected in a lot of ways, because after more than 10 years of shooting docs myself, I know what I'm seeing on set most of the time, and it's usually not Reds or Aris. You will see Red quite a bit in the natural history world, but the Aris only seem to pop up when the DP is mainly a narrative or commercial shooter who's come over to shoot a doc. Like if I Google the names of some of the people who used Aries on this list, like Daryl Ward, who shot Never Look Away, or Zoe White, who shot Will and Harper, their websites or IMDb's are focused mainly outside the doc world. That means that they're probably most familiar with an Aries workflow and used to having the crew around to help them run cameras like that, so when they move over to docs, it's just natural that they bring the same setups with them. But even though those cameras bring a lot to the table in terms of image quality and color science, I'll just straight up say that these cameras are not the ideal tool for run and gun shoots. Most of them aren't even really intended for single operators, and they kind of just assume that there's going to be a camera assistant nearby, which for the typical doc shoot I do, even for big networks, is a luxury rather than a norm. There are some exceptions on the list, like Peter Sillin, who shot all Arri for Love Machina, and he seems to be doc first, but generally speaking, the numbers back me up here. So what does that tell us? Well, for starters, it tells us that raw image quality isn't as important as things like ease of use for solo operators, or lightweight, or price. Docs usually don't have the same inflated budgets as commercials, and so it just doesn't make sense to use a $60,000 camera when you could save that cash and use it for travel or extra editing time. Next is the weight, because doc shooters don't normally get to hand the camera off to an AC between takes because there are no takes in the real world. And when you're running around all day, that weight really matters. A Sony FX9 weighs 4.4 pounds or 2 kilos, while an Amira is more than double that at 9 pounds or 4.1 kilos. The Alexa 35 is a little bit better, but it's still almost 50% heavier than the Sony at 6.5 pounds or something. But that doesn't even tell the full weight story, because usually with Aries, there's a lot of rigging involved to get them ready to shoot. Plus, you're probably going to be using PL mount glass, which is typically really heavy as well. So by the time it's all built up and ready to actually shoot with, odds are the Arri options, apart from maybe the Mini, will be at least double the weight. And for me, that's a massive negative. And then lastly, when it comes to image quality, the truth is that these days it just doesn't really matter.
No, please don't say that.
I mean, sure, if your movie costs $100 million, then why not go for the very best color science out there? But that's not even necessary these days with films like The Creator being shot on the FX3 and Civil War on the Ronin 40. The truth is that if you shoot well and expose well and use light well and have a good colorist, pretty much anything can be made to look like anything else. Now, I can't exactly guarantee it, but I'm pretty confident that if I forced one of those Alexa LF DPs to shoot their same film with maybe a C500 instead, no one would be able to tell the difference in the final product. I'm sure I triggered some narrative and commercial DPs out there who would strongly disagree with me, but I'm sorry guys, without pixel peeping, nobody cares. And anyways, most docs just don't have the cash to burn for such a tiny degree of difference anyways. Now, another surprising thing you might have noticed is that the FX6 isn't on that list when it seems like everyone in the filmmaking universe is raving about them. Now, I definitely have some thoughts on why this is, but first I just want to take a quick second and talk about something that isn't a waste of cash for documentary filmmakers, especially if you're involved in the editing, and that's a great source of royalty-free music. Man, that transition was slick. We all need music because other than No Country for Old Men, almost every film needs a score. But since docs are famously cash poor, we can't all hire dedicated composers or license famous songs. That's where today's sponsor, Audio, shines. I've been using Audio for both this channel and my personal projects for nearly 2 years now, and honestly, there just isn't a better value service out there that I've found. And I've used all the other ones too, but for my needs, they always seem just a little bit too expensive, and having tens of thousands of excess tracks that I'm never gonna use just really didn't make the price worth it. Audio, on the other hand, delivers all the same premium features like AI song matching, stem tracks for all their songs, and a massive sound effects library for a fraction of the cost. Viewers of this channel can get a year's membership for Audio's Pro plan for just $59 using the code Luke70, which is around a quarter of what most of the competition charges. And if you use the code Luke199, you can get a lifetime membership for $199, which I love even more because almost no services even let you buy lifetime these days. So if you did blow all your money on a camera you couldn't really afford but still need great music for your next project, use the link in the description and one of those codes to save a bunch of cash. Okay, so where is the FX6 on this list? I mean, it's gotta be one of the best-selling cinema cameras in the world right now, so how come they're not using it on premium stuff as much? Well, they sort of are because the FX6 was actually used on, I think, 2 shoots out of the Sundance 20, but only once as the A cam from what I can tell. It popped up again as a B cam, but the FX3 seemed like more of the go-to B cam for Sony shooters out there. So why is that? Isn't everyone saying the FX6 is the greatest solo filmmaking camera out there? Well, it kinda is, but that's the thing. Projects that are winning awards at Sundance aren't typically done by solo filmmakers. There are exceptions to this, I'm sure, but for the most part, these films have dedicated DPs. In fact, of the 20 films, only 3 of them were shot and directed by the same person, which shows you that docs of this caliber are normally made by teams, not one-man/woman bands. So yes, the FX6 might just be the perfect solo operator-director camera when you're running around doing everything yourself and you just need a small camera with great image quality. And to prove this point, the one film that did use the FX6 as the A-cam, A New Kind of Wilderness, was one of the 3 where the director and the DP were the same person. But you're still probably asking why? Well, as a doc cinematographer with more than 10 years in the industry, I have some thoughts. The FX6 is an incredible all-in-one package, but in a lot of ways, it's a jack of all trades while being a master of none. And for a lot of people, that's what makes it great. It's got insane specs in a tiny package, but its form factor makes it tough to get up on your shoulder without some serious rigging. And for DPs like me, where I spend at least a good chunk of my time shooting, that's kind of a problem. It also can't shoot Super 35 natively, so that means a whole bunch of lenses that DPs love are all off limits. A lot of the all-time great cine-zooms and primes don't work on full frame, and so FX6 shooters are limited and usually end up going with stills lenses like G Masters or Sigma Arts for their all-purpose coverage lenses. And these lenses are great. I mean, I have most of them myself, but on a larger project, I'd personally much rather shoot on something like MK Cinema Zooms or Zeiss Super Speeds or maybe Angino Zooms or Fuji Cabrios. And those are kind of the go-tos on big budget sets. And all of those lenses are Super 35 only. For reference, I'd say I shoot my FX9 on the shoulder at least half the time and in Super 35 mode more like 85% of the time. So for what I do and the way I like to shoot, the FX6 just isn't right, no matter how good the image quality is. And the equivalents from Canon are all the same, just interchange the model numbers. And even though weight does matter for doc DPs, the slightly heavier weight and more balanced weight, more importantly, can often be a good thing for professional DPs because it does balance the rigs more, it makes them less front heavy, and it cuts out all those micro jitters. And then suddenly a lot of the things that make the FX6 such an amazing tool are actually sort of points against it for my projects anyways. If I was shooting something like a hunting show or a remote expedition or anything else where every ounce mattered, then it's a different story. But for the higher end professional work I normally do, I just have a much better operator experience and a wider range of lens options using my FX9 over the FX6. And this applies just the same to the C300 or the C500. And sorry to keep bashing it, but at the same time, the FX6 is just a little too big to be considered really a small camera for me, and that's why my B cam is the FX3 and not the 6. If I was a Canon shooter, I would probably use a C300 or C500 as my A cam and a C70 as my B cam, but I'd want the size difference between them to be pretty substantial so that I could use them in different ways. When I need a B cam for an interview, the FX3 is so light that I can put it on a super cheap travel tripod, whereas a rigged up FX6, I'd have to carry around something a lot beefier. I also switch to the FX3 when I'm working in really tight spaces, like in a car, and again here I'd rather have the smaller camera. So the FX6 always sits right in the middle. It's sort of the best of both worlds, but for what I do, also kind of the worst of both worlds. Now in case you think I'm trashing it, I'm not. If I only had one camera and I was both shooting and directing at the same time, it's a no-brainer. I think I'd go with the FX6 all day. But if your goal is to work as a dedicated DP on bigger budget shoots like at Sundance, and if you want to invest in a camera system that you can rent and get onto bigger multi-cam setups, it's just something to keep in mind. And considering that every camera on this list except the FX3 is more than 5 years old, and in some cases like 10 years old, prioritizing form factor and operator experience should tell you a lot about what pro DPs really want in their cameras. And it's not the newest tech. Like the FS7 came out in 2014, and even its replacement, the FX9, has been out for almost 5 years, or maybe more than 5 years at this point. These are not the newest cameras with the coolest Mark II tech in them. These are dependable workhorses that can transition from shoulder to hip shooting as well as on and off tripods very easily. The same thing goes for the C300 and C500, because remember, this list says C300 Mark II, not Mark III, so it's also nearly 10 years old, but it's still going strong. If the only thing that mattered was specs, then the FX6 wins all day because it has better low light performance, a bigger sensor, and a bunch of other things that make it the far better camera on paper. But out in the world, shooting for 10 hours a day in all sorts of environments, the numbers show pretty clearly that there are other factors DPs value more. And I'll just say it one more time, this isn't about me bashing the FX6, because honestly, I wish I had one myself. My point here is that some of these older cameras cost a fraction of what a new camera costs, especially if you can find a used one. And just because they might be 4 to 5 years old, they are still more than capable of shooting the most beautiful documentaries on the planet. I get asked a lot of questions like, should I buy X camera or wait for the Mark II? Or I found a great deal on a C300, but the C400 just came out, or whatever. And so I just really wanted to drive it home that it doesn't matter that much. What you want in a good doc camera is something tough that can be easily rigged with good balance and that has a form factor that's good for shooting all day. It doesn't matter to me that the Burano is slightly better than my FX9, and I'm gonna shoot the FX9 into the ground before I think of swapping it out for something better. So don't chase tech and don't sleep on used gear. So what have we learned here and what are the takeaways? Well, the first is that the market is still being dominated by mid-range cinema cameras that are mostly 5+ years old. The affordability and operability of Sony and Canon cameras make them much more popular than Aries and Reds, and those trends are probably going to continue for a while still. Also, Super 35 capable cameras are just as popular, if not more popular than full-frame cameras, so don't think that full-frame always equals better. All of these cameras also accept at least 2 channels of XLR audio without using any splitters, and all of them have timecode capabilities natively except the FS7, which needs the extension back. So audio is definitely prioritized. These cameras also have a fairly similar form factor, with larger being more popular than smaller, believe it or not. Other than the FX3 that is, but that's not really accurate because I think the FX3 was only used as a B cam and never the A cam. So what should you do with all that information? Well, nothing if you don't want to. If you love your setup and it works for you, just keep using it. Just because most of these DPs are favoring shoulder mounted systems doesn't mean you have to as well, and anything will work if you know how to use it and have good access. But if your goal is to maybe one day work as a cinematographer on world-class festival-winning productions, then you might want to get some experience with cameras like these, even if they're not the newest. And when it comes to investing in gear to rent out, it's pretty clear what's in demand. Sure, that new Blackmagic 6K has great image quality and an amazing user interface, but from what I can see, not many doc crews are using it, so take that into account, or don't. The right camera depends on your needs, your budget, and the types of project you're working on. But for me anyways, it's always good to stay on top of what the best of the best are using. And then just do whatever you want. See ya.